BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Chris, one of the biggest mysteries of British politics in 2024 is getting a little bit closer to being solved.
It is, and it's the question that keeps rearing its head. When will the general election be?
And it's not going to be on the 2nd of May because in an interview with the ITV in the West Country on Thursday night, Rishi Sunak said there will not be a general election on the same day as the local mayoral and police and crime commissioner elections, which are happening that day. Now, whether you love or hate speculation about the general election campaign, the fact that there is so much and the way it's been going actually is quite revealing about what's happening in politics. So we will kick off with that on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Why can't people buy a house? Look at their wages.
Do you have any questions on things that are not related to maths?
People who say that we were partying simply do not know what they are talking about.
The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived.
It's the first time ever I've been able to say, well done, Keir.
I'll end by tempting her to update Newscast and update this house.
The Prime Minister is not under a desk.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it is Chris in Cardiff today because there's a splash of democracy and voting going on here with a new Labour leader being elected on Saturday who will become the new First Minister next week.
Speaking of other stories that have occurred today, Michael Gove, the Levelling Up and Community Secretary, unveiled the government's new definition of extremism, and he popped into the Newscast studio earlier to explain what it all means, and I asked him a few other things as well, so we will come to that shortly. But Chris, first of all, people who aren't at Westminster and aren't on political social media the whole time might have not realised just quite the frenzy that was building about the fact that maybe the general election was going to be called for the 2nd of May, which means it was going to be called very soon.
Yeah. So there's been two waves of frenzy about this, both of them predictable, to put it bluntly. Excuse my mild splash of world weariness about this sort of stuff.
Oh, he's had a long day.
So over Christmas, there was a blast of all of this stuff. And you had various folk, particularly Labour folk, coming out and saying the greatest secret in Westminster that no one dare talk about is the election is going to be in May. I think Emily Thornberry of Labour did a fair old amount of this amongst others. And then we had the Prime Minister in an interview with, I think it was the ITV East Midlands region, saying that the working assumption was that the election would be in the second half of the year. He said that in the first couple of days of January. He didn't quite rule out an election in the first 6 months, but the suggestion was it would be in the second half, in the autumn, which is when a lot of the smart money have been for some while. And that then calmed down the, ooh, is the election going to be soon thing for a bit, until the calming down went away and the hullabaloo came back in the last 10 days or so. Why? Because we were approaching the deadline at the tail end of this month, which, had it been passed without a dissolution of Parliament, you couldn't have an election at the beginning of May because there wouldn't be enough time left. So all the hullabaloo started again, a lot of it coming from people who would love an election in May, and principally in the opposition parties who've been making that argument. One or two Conservatives privately have been exploring the idea that maybe going earlier is better than going late, the idea being that things might get worse from their perspective. The vast majority of folk I speak to on the government benches, on the Conservative benches, quite a lot of Labour folk privately as well, have always worked on the assumption that it was much, much more likely to be in the autumn, because why, if you were a Prime Minister, would you volunteer to go early when the prospect of winning looks like something of a long shot, and therefore you might be throwing away precious governing months that you would otherwise be entitled to.
Then one of the other theories is that actually it's allies of Rishi Sunak who were promoting the idea of an earlier election as a way to scare Tory MPs into being more disciplined and less critical of him.
Yes, and there's also the theory that says Labour talking up the prospect of an early election also ensures that they and their rank and file are disciplined because there's a prospect of an election soon. No keener way to try and instill a certain amount of discipline than suggesting that your political battle with your real opponents in other political parties is imminent. In other words, sort of hang together. So, yeah, there are lots of forces that would tempt people and have been tempting people, my goodness, over the last few weeks to talk up this prospect, even if its likelihood was always relatively slim. And now, as far as that particular date, has been ruled out by the Prime Minister. Cue the next wave of speculation about who knows potential dates later in May or June or July, and then we can restart the whole thing about the autumn and whether it's October or does he announce that he's going to go and see the King from the conference stage or blah, blah, blah. So we have seen 2 waves of this so far in 2024, and there'll be more to come.
Basically, you're saying we're going to get one night off from this, and this is how we're spending it.
It pretty much that. I mean, it will kick the can of speculation a little bit further down the road, and then that can will start fizzing again when there's the prospect of another deadline approaching that would rule out a date in, month X, month Y, month Z. Speculation is the waft of politics, isn't it? It's there. It is there the whole time. But we should always be, skeptical about why it's happening, or at least open-minded about why people might be in the business of talking up something that may or may not be any more likely to happen as a result of that talking up.
And also, there's just not a huge amount happening in Parliament at the moment, so lots of people have got time on their hands to speculate about this, and politicians love nothing more than guessing about when the election is going to be, either because they think it's really fun or because they're really worried about losing their jobs. Also, my kind of game theory thing about this, and this is me thinking like 2 or 3 steps ahead, is because Keir Starmer is desperate for points of difference from the government, and also any kind of opportunity to attack them. Will he end up in a situation where he makes some kind of commitment about when he would be calling an election if it was Prime Minister Keir Starmer? And actually, do we have then something on the record from the Labour leader that can be then, he can be held to if he's in Downing Street, so we don't go through this rigmarole ever again?
Yeah.
But it's also hard to see a Prime Minister giving up one of the biggest trump cards they've got, which is calling an election whenever they want.
Totally. And then just to spin back to the here and now in terms of the motivations for talking up an election, if you're an opposition party, it helps to know when the election isn't going to be, because, the flip side of the point you're making is that it is a trump card for a Prime Minister. You can start to back time things to where you are putting most of your chips in private, whereas your opponents have to scatter the chips around the range of possible dates, including realistically stacking quite a lot on the most imminent date in case the government goes early. And that takes money and energy and mental bandwidth, which the governing party, even if it's not actually decided, because why would you necessarily 100% decide potentially a long way out, you can mentally stack your chips in a particular place, and the opposition parties can't do that. So flushing out anything approaching clarity or just more information, which as a result of this wave of speculation they've managed to do, you can then plan around what you then know. And certainly when I speak to folk in government, they do lean again back on that remark, that formulation from January about the working assumption being the second half of the year, which means sort of July onwards, if you take that at the sort of the letter of each and every syllable.
Right, let's look at something that did actually happen today rather than something that isn't happening. The government unveiled its new definition of extremism. This is the definition the government will use for itself when it comes to their dealings with individuals and groups and campaigners. There's a bit of politics here. The government says it's as a response to the increase in extremism and concern around all sorts of issues since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. So they feel that they can sort of own that a bit, or at least own the response to that a bit. But of course, this has come in the week where a big Conservative donor has been accused of making some off-colour comments that maybe some people would say are quite extreme in themselves. So it's never simple. And the person who was holding the pen for this new definition of extremism is the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, because the other part of his department is communities and local government. And he came into the newscast studio to explain what's been going on. Michael Gove, welcome back to Newscasts.
Hi.
We were talking about flats and rent last time, weren't we? So you get all the thorny issues of our era.
Yes, I mean the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities is, it's a sprawling